Welcome back to Birds of a Feather Talk Together. This week we wanted to talk about blue jays. It's a fun episode where we kind of jumped around on a number of different topics. We started off talking about the sharp-tailed grouse that Amanda and I saw in Colorado, and then after that we get into the blue jay. We kind of meander through a few different things, covering bird flu and how it impacted blue jay populations, why blue jays have such an inconsistent and different kind of migration pattern, if any. We also talk about the relationship with acorns and spreading oak trees across the country. As always, John and Shannon provide a lot of really cool info and leave us all looking at blue jays in a new and amazing way. Okay, let's go grab our binoculars and get into it. Well, welcome back, everyone. So today we're going to talk about the blue jay. I think first we wanted to tell just a little story about something cool that happened to us over the holidays when we were out in Colorado and we saw a grouse. We were driving down the street and saw like a couple, we thought they were sage grouse, and there's a lot of sage grouse like in the area out there. And so we took some pictures and kind of went on our way. And John and Shannon, we even sent like you a picture and we were bragging about what we saw because we thought it was cool. And then posted it on social media and somebody was like, that's not a sage grouse. And so we didn't even think to put it in eBird when we first saw it. We were like, oh yeah, we knew what it was. And eBird was like, oh no, this is a sharp-tailed grouse. So we looked it up and there were sharp-tailed grouse, like, I don't know, a lot of them are native, it sounds like, to Canada and to Alaska. And there is like a small population if you look at like their map that happens to be in Northwest Colorado. So we were, I don't know, just thought it was cool. Shannon, you're always talking about how important technology is and tracking all that. And this was like something we saw in real time that without all the apps and tracking everything and posting it, like we would have had no idea. We would have just gone on our way. So we thought that was really cool.
Well, I'm just glad the community was nice to you because sometimes they can be rather biting for people who misidentify things.
I know. I was embarrassed. I was like, oh, they're coming for us.
No, so what I would emphasize with respect to that is that's the beauty of technology from the perspective of helping get it right and learning what stuff is. I've over the years taking photos and things, I've misidentified plenty of stuff, and I'm always interested when the eBird editors come back and say, "No, that's not a gull-billed tern. It's a Forster's tern," and it's like, okay, yeah.
It's amazing how accurate it is because when you look at the picture of it looked like a sage grouse from the photo, and it's like the fact that they could tell the detail. It was just kind of some coloring around the eye really is what was like so different. And it's amazing, like the technology that it can identify that. And I don't know, we were really impressed by that.
And it's, obviously artificial intelligence allows them to train things off a lot of photos. And so that's one of the neat aspects of that. And yet at the same time, it's not perfect. In other words, you could find instances where the technology will tell you something and it may actually be wrong still.
Yeah. Are either of you super familiar with grouse? Because we started looking at like grouse, like mating dances and things online, like after looking it up, and now we're super into grouse, especially the sharp-tailed grouse. They're really, really impressive.
Yep, prairie chickens and...
I mean, they have it all, right? They not only do they dance, they have amazing feathers, they have colored skin. It's a lot of fun to watch them. Now you're using technology for your own benefit. And, everybody makes mistakes. Even the best bird watchers in the whole world make mistakes. It just used to be a lot harder to catch them on it, right? Because they weren't submitting photos for the whole world to look at or recordings for the whole world to hear. And even if you have a bird in the hand in the field, depending on where you are, you can't necessarily identify it. So, you can never be that perfect in identifying birds. I can't even get close to that, but even the best people can't be perfect.
And even we have specimens in the collection that have been identified as one thing for a long period of time, and then somebody comes through and with some other characters like you're talking about with the face on the grouse and says, hey, wait a minute, I think this is actually something else. And the neat thing is we can begin to check that out. If you really want to, you can get genetic data from it and the specimen, and you can begin to look at what what it actually is genetically relative to other samples and things. And so we've had things that have been re-identified in our collection that way, after long periods of time as being identified as something else.
I have this bizarre story. I love tea, as you guys know. And I ordered tea, and I got this tea, and there was a bird feather in the tea. And my mom, that grossed her out completely, right? So she's like, "Did you drink it?" I'm like, "Yeah, of course I did." But so we took the feather and amplified DNA from the feather and could show that it was a barn swallow, and it was a barn swallow from the place that the tea came from. So that barn swallow dropped its feather in the tea, and it got dried in the tea and made its way all the way to Chicago, Illinois, for me to open up the package and see that feather. So
that's amazing.
That's crazy. Wait, so where did it come from, Shannon?
It was from India, and there's enough genetic variation in barn swallows that you could tell that the genetic variation that it had put it in that part of the world. So it wasn't a North American barn swallow or any other way along the route.
That is hilarious.
Wow. That's incredible.
Yeah, you're brave. I like birds and I like tea, but I wouldn't like that.
Oh, there's bugs and things like that in everything you eat.
But that's true.
Just a fact. It might be gross, but it's just a fact. And now there's all that plastic in the things that you drink in bottled water. It's kind of frightening, the amount of microplastics.
Yeah, you're right.
Even bottled water. I'll take a bird feather over microplastics any
feather.
day.
We'd be better off eating feathers like the Puteki Teki does.
There we go.
Exactly. Like the Puteki.
All right, well, should we get into talking about the blue jay?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, let's talk about blue jays.
Cool. Well, yeah, we're really excited to talk about blue jays. We see a ton of them around us, and they're, beautiful birds, obviously. And I feel like we've always seen them, growing up around the Midwest in our backyards and everything. But since we've gotten more involved with our binoculars, you really see the amount of detail in their feathers. And I mean, really, they're just so spectacular, all the color with them.
I did not grow up with blue jays. I grew up with Steller's jays. So when I first moved to the East, which even though this is the Midwest, I was really, for people who live in the West, this is East. The first time I saw a blue jay, I was like, wow, holy cow, that thing's amazing. And now they're expanding their range into Canada and moving west. So, and even, I guess, interbreeding with the Steller's jays. But yeah, so blue jays were a real treat here. They annoy my mom, the Steller's jays do, because they're really loud and squawky, which is part of their appeal, I suppose, the whole chattering jay thing.
And then I was reading that they are one of the birds that really will mimic other birds and hawks and things in the area. And we didn't realize that until starting to research before this episode. But there's been plenty of times where we're out birding and think we hear a hawk and are looking around and there's a blue jay nearby. And we just thought that maybe their call sounded similar. But, before coming here today, we were reading and it sounds like they actually try to impersonate them, either as a self-defense mechanism or to alert other people, other jays that there could be a hawk nearby.
Yeah, I feel like their mimicry is pretty rudimentary compared to some other birds in the world, and yet at the same time, it's when you see that, a lot of times it's along the lines of putting out imitations of predators and things like that.
Yeah, I don't think they're not mimicking other songbirds or anything like that, I don't think, right? Just kind of larger birds of prey. Is that right, John?
I mean, I would say that there's some vocalizations that were confusing people. I mean, people were hoping were actually sounded a little like ivory-billed woodpeckers at one point too. Oh. Yeah, I mean, I think they have a weird variety of calls when you actually are around them and hearing them on a regular basis.
That's just what the world needs, more things that could be mistaken for ivory-billed woodpeckers.
To me, one of the interesting things about blue jays is they're considered to be a resident bird. In other words, they're here year round in a lot of their distribution. And yet at the same time, it's a good portion of the population actually migrates. And you really notice that in the spring, because sometimes on spring days along the lakefront in Chicago, you can actually have flocks of birds moving south. I've seen several hundred in a morning moving south along the lakefront, which is completely contrary to what you'd expect for spring migration. And what's going on there is it's a reverse migration of birds that were moving north the night before and decided they actually wanted to reorient and probably get around the southern end of the lake and get over into Michigan to proceed up to their breeding grounds. And so I've always found it an interesting bird, because you think about it as resident, and yet there's a good proportion of the population that's actually migrating each year.
But so are they migrating not north and south? They're actually going like east and west? So they're going to Michigan instead? Or
No, I think those Michigan birds ended up on the wrong side of the lake that morning during migration. And so they're reorienting to get back into the right direction and the right part of the distribution that they want to be in.
Oh, interesting.
I mean,
It
Lake
sounds like they
Michigan
have a pretty
may
Go
only
ahead, Shannon.
it may be only a lake, but it's pretty big. So if you're not seeing the other side of it, if you're a bird that's getting up a little bit on the west side when you want to be on the east side.
And then do they have a pretty inconsistent migration? It sounds like there's some that will migrate some years and decide not to other years, and some that will never migrate, and some that are always migrating. What is it about blue jays in general that, I know that no one really knows what causes them to migrate and not migrate and everything, but why are they so inconsistent compared to other birds?
Well, I think the mechanism of what determines whether they migrate may not be entirely understood, but a lot of the hypotheses are based on food availability. So they really like acorns, and oaks are notorious for masting in some areas, some years, and other areas in other years. And I think at some level that leads to the evolution of blue jays being a little bit what they call facultative, meaning they're if they go to a place that had acorns the year before and there aren't acorns, they'll keep moving till they find another place that has a better crop for them to spend the winter feeding on.
I always wonder, because they have that flexibility, I guess if you're going to rely on a food source that does that, is intermittent and irregular and where you might find it, I wonder if that makes them more able to withstand climate change because it's built into their genes to move around looking for food, or to not think it's always going to be in the same place. So I wonder if blue jays will survive climate change easier as long as there aren't more diseases that come through and kill them, like West Nile virus did. So that just struck me when I was thinking about blue jays before we started.
And you said they've expanded recently, right? That they are up to British Columbia now, Shannon, or they're almost in that area?
Yeah, no, they are.
Is that
they definitely
been a result of climate change, or they are?
Yeah. I would imagine it is, despite how cold it is here this week, the planet is still warming at a rather dramatic pace. So places that weren't as hospitable are, and getting across the Great Plains is different. And oak planting, can enable them to move slowly across the landscape as long as there are oaks there that they can eat their acorns. Yeah, it's kind of fascinating. I don't know. Where do they go? How far west do they go? How far north do they go?
Do they store acorns as well?
They do.
Oh.
Which is pretty neat too. So they'll just store these little tiny caches of acorns all over the place. And then in theory go back and find them and eat them. But if not, if they're not eating them all, they're moving them, which is a really important part of the environment, the ecology forests really important because they're seed dispersers. So they're moving the seeds and enabling oaks to grow where they move.
They're like Johnny Appleseed, but for acorns.
Also, they're also notoriously open in their diet. And so in the breeding season, they will travel around and they're not adverse to picking nestlings out of other birds' nests of other species. And so some of the field workers who do a lot of work on breeding birds in eastern North America have to be fairly careful as they're going around working on whatever species they're studying, not to have blue jays start following them and finding the nests afterwards.
Oh, they did that to me.
Oh, no.
I was working, but well, not them, but Steller's jays, same kind of thing. In the Sierras in California, we were trying to find fox sparrow nests with babies of particular ages in it. And the jays started following us every morning when we would get up because they learned what we were doing. So they would follow us.
Oh, my gosh.
And we were, obviously, until we figured out what was going on, we were leading them right to, the filet mignon and some little baby fox sparrow. Couldn't move. Didn't have feathers. Couldn't run or fly away. Some tasty morsel for a jay. Yeah, they are super smart.
That
like
was
crows.
Pretty smart.
Yeah. Well, they're in the same family as crows.
Yeah.
So, that whole family has a lot of intelligence. They do a little bit of tool using, but not as much as other birds do, other corvids do. So apparently they can use pieces of paper to kind of scoot things over to themselves to either look at or eat. If they're in cages. So that's one of the things from ones that are in captivity that people have learned. So they do have kind of a little bit of that higher order thinking to use one object to do something else. And obviously they're bright blue, right? They're incredibly pretty.
Yeah. I wanted to hear you talk about the color, Shannon.
Again, there's no blue in the bird, me as the broken record of color. So you can make browns and grays and blacks look really cool if you put them inside of a structural feather that enables them to reflect other colors of light back to you. And there's a lot of variation in facial markings too. So if you were to come in the collection and look at the series of jays that we have, you can see a lot of variation. It makes me wonder if they can identify individuals with that facial marking. I don't know. And it dawned on me when I was, I went and looked at them. I guess that was yesterday. And there's all these camera traps now that can identify the individuals of big cats because the markings on them are so distinctive they can identify individuals, and the camera traps are finding new individuals. And it made me wonder when I put those things together, and it made me wonder whether using artificial intelligence, we could actually know whether these birds are individually identifiable using artificial intelligence tools. Anyways, my brain goes weird places sometimes.
Do you have at the Field Museum? How many specimens?
We have 890. Actually, I thought we would have more than that. But I guess 890 birds of that size is pretty big.
So you said they were smart, and I think that's a big aspect of it. So they're diurnal migrants for the most part, even though I mentioned earlier that I think these birds are flying at least at some point dusk and dawn, such that they get out over the lake. But they don't tend to hit windows very often, and I think that's probably a measure of either an aspect of their visual acuity combined with their mental capacity to sense what a window is a little better than some other species can.
I had a question going back to their diet. So I was just reading about, there was like a study talking about how the percentage of their diet that it's insects and acorns and nuts and fruits. And there was a study that I saw where they were talking about how they only found like trace amounts of other bird eggs and nestlings in like 6 stomachs out of like over 500 that they researched. And so I was curious if like, are they not necessarily eating the other, when they're going in and raiding eggs, or are they just for some reason killing them, or is it for sure that it is part of their diet? 'Cause I thought that was interesting that it was such a small amount.
Oh man, I love that piece of information. Good question. I mean, it's a beautiful example of why you would get data like that, because it may tell you things that you weren't thinking about.
I guess
I wonder.
it's pretty dramatic when they do that. So people probably overemphasize how many times they're followed, and you see them taking a baby or an egg out of a nest. So it might take on, because it might take on more than the frequency of it actually suggests. I don't know. I know my experience with Steller's jays is that they were totally 100% eating the birds that we, served to them basically on a silver platter because they weren't there the next day when we went to look for them again. The babies were not there. So, and the jays learned pretty fast to get near us every morning. Every morning we woke up, they were there.
I think a lot of it may just illustrate a level of opportunism. In other words, when they find something like that, they'll take advantage of it. But most of the time, they're going after the vegetable material, the acorns and other things that they can get. That's really interesting. One other thing I was going to point out about blue jays, which from a birding perspective, is when I'm out birding and I hear blue jays, and they're notorious for mobbing things. And so, I've often break off whatever I'm doing if some blue jays start calling on the other side of a park or a cemetery, and walk over there to see if I can figure out what they're going after. And it's a great way to find great horned owls, for instance, roosting in a tree, because the blue jays have found them first and are letting everything else know that there's a great horned owl in the area.
So they ant too, right? I just went and
oh no,
I found there's actually a blog post by a Cornell undergrad pointing to an actual scientific paper that came out in 2008, because there's a lot of debate about what they're doing with ants. So you could either use the formic acid to repel parasites, or apparently it tastes bad. It's very bitter. And so it turns out that if you give jays the ability to choose between ants from which that formic acid gland has been removed, they chow them down like no business. And if it's ones that don't have that, that's when they pick them up very gently, but they smash them and get the formic acid out on their feathers, and then they eat them. So I guess it's that they know they're bitter, and so they're getting the formic acid off the ant before they eat it.
If you look in the animal behavior books, they were involved in some of the very famous experiments with mimicry in butterflies, where the monarch butterflies actually, because of feeding on milkweed, are actually toxic. And so if the blue jays eat a monarch butterfly caterpillar, they'll throw it up. And other species of butterflies have come to mimic the monarchs in order to avoid predation, even though they don't have the toxicity that the monarchs do.
Oh, wow. How does a caterpillar mimic another caterpillar? In what way?
That's what evolution does.
The adults do. Yeah. And they can look like, I think they look similar.
Wow.
We could do a whole thing on a neat bird from South America called Cinereus mourner, which actually has chicks that mimic caterpillars in order to avoid predation.
Wow.
Cool.
Yeah,
We'll have to talk about that.
The closer you get to looking like something that tastes awful, if you don't taste awful, they'll leave you alone. So if you're a pretty good mimic, because the cost of making a mistake can be that you could die depending on what the noxious substance is. So you're better off if you don't have those noxious chemicals. mimicking, looking like something that does. And that happens across the tree of life. There's these kinds of mimicking things that can happen. It's really fun to study. There's some professors at the University of Chicago who are looking at how butterflies' wings get made and how genetic pathways are altered to change the different patterns and colors. So there's a whole lot you can do to understand how things got to look that way, and then what something that's mimicking it might have to do the same thing. So if there's multiple things that end up mimicking something, do they all do it the same way, or do they take different paths to get to the same endpoint, which is looking like something that tastes terrible?
I wanted to ask, so RJ and I heard somewhere that like the northern cardinal is the state bird for multiple states, maybe the most states, and then the American robin and the American goldfinch are also the state bird for multiple states, but the blue jay is not the state bird for any of the U.S. states. And I wanted to get your thoughts on that, why that is.
Well, they're loud and obnoxious.
Poor choices, I guess.
They're loud.
I think blue jays are awesome.
People, all you have to do is ask my mom and you'll find out. Oh, those damn things, they're so loud, making noise first thing in the morning, and they never stop. So I imagine that they're pesty like that to people. But they're so pretty. I guess if you saw them but didn't hear them, you might be more likely to make them your state bird, maybe.
There is no professional baseball team called the Goldfinches, I think.
That's true.
That's true.
That's true.
So at least they got a baseball team.
Yes. Yeah.
It's in Canada.
Yeah. Do you guys think they are bigger? Like, I think they have a reputation of being a bully, like at bird feeders and stuff. Do you think they are bigger bullies than other birds?
That's an interesting question. I would say at our feeders, I'm impressed with how cautious they are to come in, and we only get them sort of in spring and fall when they're on the move. And I'm sure they would drive off other birds, but at the same time, the ones that we have come in are kind of waiting for everything else to leave, and then they come in and leave pretty quickly.
Yeah, I think
so. That's a really interesting question.
They're certainly bigger songbirds, right? So they could big dog their way through the feeders. House sparrows certainly do, but I don't. House sparrows will push things that could, bite their heads off in a second off the feeder, including blue jays, including cardinals. But I don't think of them being overly aggressive. But I haven't studied that in any detail. But they are loud, so
maybe that's what it is more. Yeah.
I think they can be loud, and then there are other times where you see them and they're just literally going about their business. So they're in the fall in the parks and forest preserves around here. I mean, they're caching acorns, and they'll spend almost all their time doing it until they find a hawk or an owl that they want to try to drive out of the area. And so that's one of the places that they do kind of essentially try to bully birds of prey out of their areas once they find them. I've seen them cluster, 4 or 5 of them show up around a Cooper's hawk in a tree and literally just start screaming at it till it finally just takes off and leaves.
A lot of the natural wildlife departments and forestry departments across the U.S. have really interesting little paragraphs about blue jays, in that they're really important to after fires go through for forest rehab, because they bring the acorns, they bring back in the pines and the and the oaks, and so I thought that was an interesting. So they're not always pesty to people. And frankly, one of my first introductions not too long after moving to Chicago was watching their populations fall off a cliff after West Nile virus went through. So they're an indicator species of West Nile virus, and the number of dead Jays is a good indication of how many people are getting infected because they are so susceptible that their numbers just crashed. And they crashed, it looks like, looking at the data, they kind of crashed unevenly and recovered unevenly. So even though populations have largely recovered in many places, there are still places like the North Shore of Chicago where the population numbers are less than they were in 1999 and 2000, right before West Nile started coming through here. So I find that interesting too. They used to be more common than they are now. So corvids in general were really susceptible to West Nile virus. They think 30% of crows died during that. That's a lot. I know crows were there are a lot of crows, but it was noticeable.
It's crazy.
I think there's an interesting aspect of that associated with the mosquito that carried West Nile, or that carries West Nile, which is introduced. And so it also seems like one of the things that would happen is the corvid populations like crows and jays would decline in the urban areas and suburban areas that had the mosquito, but not as much in more rural areas where the mosquito wasn't occurring. So we do a Christmas bird count out in Blanchardville, Wisconsin, which is 90 miles west of Madison. And it's just a rural farm area. And our numbers of blue jays and crows actually didn't change that much during the COVID years.
No, West Nile years, you mean?
And the West Nile years, during the West Nile years of COVID years. What am I saying? Yeah.
But they weren't the only species. The biggest thing, most noticeable thing for me was chickadees. So chickadees were another species that was really vulnerable. One of, I think, the biggest 7 of them: blue jays, robins, eastern bluebirds, tufted titmice, house wrens, and chickadees. And the chickadees took a really long time to recover. We used to, when we lived in a townhouse close to Lake Michigan, we used to have chickadees at a feeder we had stuck to our window, so not exactly the nicest location for some bird seed. And after West Nile came through, there were no chickadees for several years around our townhouse, or even in the house we live in now when we moved in. Now they're regular, but still not really common. That was sad.
I think we're kind of getting close on time here. Should we try to wrap it up? Was there anything else we want to jump into?
I don't think so. They're a wonderful bird.
Yeah.
We do have so somebody today just wrote us a mailbag question that I haven't sent you guys yet. It's just a request for another bird.
Oh.
So I can read it to you now, and we can just do a little teaser, and if we don't want to talk about it, we can cut it. But this guy just emailed like an hour ago. So this is Carl, and Carl said, just started listening to the podcast and see you haven't made one about puffins yet. They're my favorite bird, and I'd love to learn more about them. Thanks.
Well, I would
So
say the
puffin?
Western puffins win. Eastern puffins are okay, but tufted puffins are one of the cutest birds in all of birddom. So yeah, we should definitely talk about tufted puffins. For anybody who's in the West, tufted puffins are awesome.
And in the East, common puffins actually have some interesting stories associated with declines as a result of warming oceans and changing fisheries. So there's been some really interesting data on them recently.
But yeah,
Great.
we could
We could definitely put that on the list.
I mean,
episode.
The one thing is that
Sweet.
they're shorebirds, right? Which is like blows your mind when you think about that's related to a sandpiper. It's not other seabirds, not gulls or terns or albatrosses or anything like that. They're related to sandpipers.
So they're not related to penguins?
Nope.
No.
Yeah.
Wow.
So that's a whole neat story, that family. And they are related to gulls and terns, right?
Oh yeah, I guess that's fair.
All right. Well, let's do a puffin episode then next time we record.
Definitely.
All right. Well, John, do you want to close it out? for our Blue Jay episode?
Yeah, I think Goldfinch would be a great name for a baseball team, but I don't think it's as good as blue jay.
Agreed.
Thanks, everyone, for listening. If you have a question for us that you'd like us to read and answer on the podcast, you can send it to podcast.birdsofafeather@gmail.com. If you haven't already, make sure to click subscribe or follow in your podcast app so you always get our newest episodes sent your way. Follow us on Instagram to see amazing photos of the different bird specimen that we discuss. And also, we now just joined TikTok. There isn't any dancing, but there are a lot of cool photos of birds, so check that out. All right, thanks everyone for the support. See you all next week.